The Tyne, the sight of it, the sound of it, the feelings it stirs. If you know the waters of Tyne, they run in your blood. What's my kind of Tyne? The Tyne Rivers have played a hugely important part in my life. Many happy days have been spent fishing here. It's where I learnt to swim, for goodness sake. So I feel deeply connected to the conservation and upkeep of these absolutely beautiful, biodiverse habitats. At last, a river born millions of years ago has been given a voice. Celebrating its 20th year in 2024, the Tyne Rivers Trust is the only charity whose sole job is to look after the Tyne and the rivers that feed it. For a better river, better region, and better life for all. And what a job! From source to sea, this living river keeps changing character. From wild Tyne to country Tyne, downtown Tyne, and seagoing Tyne. Like me, everyone has their personal Tyne, depending on what they do beside it, in it, and on it. And it's very likely the Trust is helping you make the most of it. We're succeeding by tackling pollution, taking action on conservation, working with partners, schools and communities, and applying science and environmental skills. Let's see what this means for your kind of Tyne. Is yours a walker's river? What could be more stress-relieving than strolling beside this natural, ever-flowing beauty? To ease your way, we at the Trust and our supporters are stabilising banks and protecting against erosion with willow weaving and tree planting, which also provides shade for livestock. And we're vigorously combating invasive species like Himalayan balsam and Japanese knotweed. Or is yours a Tyne for fishing? In the 1960s, the river downstream was so polluted it wasn't even classed as water, with few fish caught. But with our help, today it's becoming the best salmon river in England, worth millions to the local economy. To overcome obstacles to leaping salmon and trout returning to spawn, we've designed and built fish passes like this one at Hexham Bridge. Other signs of river health are rare freshwater pearl mussels and white-clawed crayfish living in the North Tyne. Although both are endangered, projects are underway to reverse the decline. There's a lot to be learnt from the Tyne. We can actually bring the river to the river stewards of our future. This interactive model simulates the flow of water and the effect of rainfall over land. Even better, we bring the classroom to the river itself. We work with schools, encouraging children to get their wellies wet, discovering the river's tiny inhabitants, like mayfly nymphs, then watching them grow. We also make sure learning is lifelong. On community open days, we teach local people how to test the health of the river. Is yours a business Tyne? As you'd expect, at its mouth there's a thriving port for cargo, passenger and car ferries, and these days for cruise ships too. More surprisingly, the quaysides, once shunned by business, are now sought-after office locations, which is great for workforce well-being. On one of our bespoke team-building days, colleagues can engage with nature and each other in tasks like litter picking, tree planting, and removing invasive species. Maybe yours is a Tyne for action. Swimming, paddleboarding, rowing, running, sailing. Your pleasure depends a lot on water quality and flow. In bygone times, the source of the South Tyne was dominated by metal mining, and lead and tin residues still contaminate the headwaters. And in our own times, climate change impacts the Tyne extensively. We see exceptional rainfall causing flash floods, which fills rivers with sediment. We also suffer extended high temperatures, longer periods of drought, and shifts in seasons which have a knock-on effect to life cycles and food chains. To combat the effects, we apply green engineering techniques, like coir matting and ingenious log barriers. We use natural materials to build leaky dams that slow and reduce the flow. As they grow, the trees we plant absorb and store CO2 emissions. Their shade cools the water for the wildlife, and their roots suck water from saturated agricultural land. To reduce runoff from agriculture and forestry, we're working with the farmers and landowners to provide solutions which can be as simple as ploughing along contours rather than downhill. So what is your own kind of Tyne? Relaxing, invigorating, soothing, inspiring, beautiful, romantic, exciting, challenging, Instagrammable. We're proud of the transformations we've made over the past 20 years. We can make an even bigger difference over the next 20. Whatever you love about these rivers, the Tyne Rivers Trust is with you from source to sea. For a better river, better region, and better life for all.
Kindly narrated by Xander Alexander Armstrong, who some of you may know from Classic FM, others from the Pointless programme, who's very helpful for us, really. So, the Tyne's an iconic river known throughout the world for its place in the history of coal and metal mining, shipbuilding and engineering, but a wonderful bridges and, of course, as one of the best salmon rivers in England. It's huge. Including its tributaries, the waterways are 4,500 kilometres in length and drain a catchment of almost 750,000 acres. I hope the video gives you a perspective on the Tyne Rivers, and tonight we'll focus on some of the natural history areas of the work that we do. So, we're going to go on an adventure tonight, beginning in the estuary. We're going to move up to the salmon spawning grounds and then travel down the North Tyne in the company of the freshwater pearl mussels and white-clawed crayfish. And then we're going to move across south to the Ulston area of the South Tyne to talk about the metal mining legacy. And then we're going to come nearer to home to our work on the Ousburn, and finally to your very own Gosforth Nature Reserve. I hope you enjoy the journey with me. So, why did TRT start? Well, in the early noughties, it was recognised that the Tyne Tunnel was unable to cope with the volume of traffic trying to use it. And the proposal was to lay a second tunnel on the riverbed to the east of the existing tunnel. This required digging a trench using a suction cutter in the riverbed and then laying 4 large tubes connected together and then connected to the landmass itself. Paul Torday, who was then chair of the Tyne Rivers Owners and Occupiers Association, or TRUA for short, thankfully, recognised that the environmental damage caused by dredging would be enormous in the estuary. 1 million tonnes was needed to be dug out in a trench to lay these 4 tubes in. And so to overcome the environmental concerns, some might say to buy off the environmental concerns, then £250,000 was set aside for habitat works on the Tyne, and also the cost of a fish pass to be built at Hexham, subject to the being managed not by TRUA, because TRUA is owner and occupiers of the Tyne, many of the wealthy landowners, but by a charitable institution. And so Paul, along with Andrew Davison, who some of you may know as a solicitor in the town and a great player of the Northumbrian pipes, got together with a local farmer and then with the stimulus of Ian Gregg, who's in the who is chairman of the Tweed Foundation, and Aidan Pollard, who still works for Tyne Rivers Trust but is extremely knowledgeable on the river, they set up the Tyne Rivers Trust. And the founding principles were there, as you can read on screen, and they've stood the test of time, and they remain as true today as they were when we set off 20 years ago. So I make no apology for talking a little bit about the Atlantic salmon. I'm no fisherman, but it's an iconic species and an indicator of marine and liver health. It's also one of the few species of fish called anadromous, as it's born in freshwater, lives in saltwater, and then returns to the freshwater again to spawn. The life cycle of the salmon is interesting. So eggs are laid in redds up in the gravel beds. They're hollowed out in the gravel by the female flapping her tail, and then a male cock immediately passes over the redds to fertilise the eggs. They need to be fertilised within 30 seconds because otherwise the eggs in the water swell and the little pores that are open to allow the sperm in become closed off. The adult salmon don't feed in the river, and so almost all of them die shortly after spawning from exhaustion. A few, though, however, return to this as kelps to feed and come back a second time round, but not very many. The eggs require clean, cool, well-oxygenated water, and these conditions are usually found around this time of year in the late autumn when spawning on the Tyne peaks. If the redds suffer a high silt burden, then the eggs become suffocated and they won't hatch. A few months later, in the early spring, the eggs do hatch, with the yolk sac remaining attached as the young alevin grow. And after about a month, the yolk is exhausted, and the fish, now called fry, feed on invertebrates in the river. And as the fry mature, they develop distinctive markings for camouflage and are called parr. They live in the river for 1 or 2 years and then migrate downstream to the estuary. And at that point, they're called smolts, and they stay in the estuary for a while their physiology changes to adapt to the salt water, and the hormones allow them to excrete much more salt through their urinary system. Once they've adapted, then they head off to they leave the estuary and head out to sea to the North Atlantic feeding grounds. Roughly about 1% of the alevins survive to get out to sea, but only about 0.5% of those actually manage to survive their ocean journey, fattening up in the Greenland area and then come back again. And so at the end of the day, there are about 10,000 salmon each year that manage to make that journey and get back to spawn again. How do they get back to the same place? Well, they navigate through the oceans using the magnetic fields of the Earth. When they get into the river, they were imprinted as fry and as parr their surroundings in the river, and so they're able to home back to the gravel redds where they were actually born. An amazing system. So what's happened to the numbers of salmon? Well, it's declined markedly over the centuries, and more particularly too over the last few decades, as we can see here. In fact, it's got to the state now where it takes roughly 10 days of fishing to catch one salmon. However, fishing is about being on the river and away from the hurly-burly of modern life. And so rather than catching a lot of fish, and especially now it's catch and release rather than catch and eat, the fishermen don't seem to mind that it takes so long. The decline, however, across the UK is not universal, and the Tyne has fared better than most. So that it was terrible in the 50s and 60s, as you heard in the film, but it's gradually picked back up again to reasonable levels. So why were things so bad back in the 50s and the 60s? Well, heavy industry dominated the river from the start of the Industrial Revolution, polluting the water with chemicals and waste products. And then the habitat was damaged in the upper reaches of the river with farming, and with silt getting into the river and runoffs from the land. And as you've seen, a good practice is to plough along the contours rather than up and down to try and reduce the sediment going into the river and the spill-offs from putting chemicals and things on the land. And then finally, there's obstruction to migration from the historical weirs which were made in the industrial times so that the water could power the mills and so on and so forth. So what drove the recovery? Why did it all get better? Well, I'd like to say that it's down to the fantastic charity which I'm privileged to be chair of, but unfortunately it's probably not the case. So the real thing that happened was closure of industry, which came about by the Pollution Control Act. And the second thing that really happened was the Tyneside sewage system. So unbelievably, up until the very early 80s, the sewage from everywhere in Tyneside went straight into the river, causing huge problems, not only for the fish, of course, but also the smell of the river and everything else. And so the scheme was developed to capture all this, and the black lines are the pipes that connect all those interconnecting sewers together down the coast, and to pull it all into Howden. So even the south side of the River Gateshead, they collected their sewage into these pipes and then put it underneath the river and brought it back up into Howden to treat the river. So a big foresight of those people at that time. And it made the huge difference that you can see the salmon started to return. And the reason they returned was they could survive going through the estuary. So when all this pollution was in the estuary, the dissolved oxygen saturation was horrible. You can see from the grey on the graph that it's less than 40%, and that's not survivable for fish to either come in from the estuary and get up to the upper reaches, or indeed, as the smolts, to come down to the estuary to change their physiology and then go out to sea. So, made a huge difference over the decades, just these two acts. And that's really encouraging, because at the moment we seem paralysed in what we can do in terms of big projects and things like that. But this just shows that with some foresight, with some legislation, and admittedly with some cash put into it, this is the kind of difference that can be made. And of course it's not only allowed the salmon to go up the river, but it's also brought people back to the quayside and the businesses and the wealth back into the centre of Newcastle. And not just that, but of course in the upper reaches as well. And a lot of the rural areas of the catchment are very dependent upon the fishing community coming in, staying in hotels, going to the pub for lunches, and so on and so forth. So from the point of view of the economy, it's made a huge difference and more than has paid for itself. So I want to turn now to the Kielder Dam and the impact that that's had upon the Tyne. So the Kielder Dam was completed in 1982 even, and it was recognised before it was actually built that this was going to have a big impact on the fishing in the Tyne itself. And the reason you can see on the slide is, that it's going to be damaged. The gravel can no longer go through because of the barrier. So if you haven't got the gravel in the river, then there's no redds for the salmon to lay their eggs. The other issue that needs to be thought about is temperatures. So spawning and then the development of the eggs is very temperature dependent. And the Kielder, as a body of water, warms up in the summer and then cools down later in the winter than the river it does, so that when you have releases in the autumn from Kielder, it makes the river warmer than it would naturally be, and that's not good for the eggs to be fertilised. And then in the spring, when the releases happen, the water is cooler than the river would naturally be, and so the fry and the alevin struggle to grow, and it inhibits their growth. And when they finally emerge, there's not so many insects around for them to feed on as there would be if they came out of the natural time. So fortunately, this was recognised, and so 4 years before the Kielder Dam was built, they decided that they'd build a hatchery. And I'm grateful to Richard Bond, who took me under his wing up at the hatchery not so long ago to give me an insight into how it went ahead. You could say, well, why did you want a hatchery? Why didn't we have a fish pass? And the reason is, of course, that the dam is really high, and it wasn't thought that the fish would actually get up that height. And the second issue was that the gravel in Kielder was taken out of the area of the lake to make the forest trails. And also, of course, Kielder flooded the little tributaries that came into it, and so they weren't existent. So even if the fish could manage to leap up the pass, then when they got there, there'd be nothing for them to be able to do, really. So the hatchery captures the salmon at this time of year, so they're doing it right now. And they use the electrofishing technique, so to pass a small current into the water stuns the fish, and then you're able to pick the fish up and take them up above the dam to it's the north end of Kielder where the hatchery is. And they take the hen and massage to get the eggs, and then do exactly the same as you would do in the river. They take the cocks and get their sperm and put it immediately over the eggs. And then the cock and the hen, they return back to the river, so they don't kill them. Some parts of the world kill them, but we don't here in the Tyne. And then the eggs hatch in the spring, and they're kept in tanks as they grow. And it's mainly salmon, but also a few trout too. And then once they've grown, they get released later on in the summer, and they release about 160,000 par and fry into the river, where they swim around for a couple of years and then eventually head out to sea. So that's the process. So it's not just the river that threatens the salmon, but there are ocean threats as well. So the sand eel is one of their main sources of feed as they go up through to the Greenland areas. And sand eels are in demand for their oil and usage as animal feed for livestock and also for farmed salmon. Each year, industrial trawling removes hundreds of thousands of tons of sand eels out of the North Sea, and removing these prey animals from the food chain. The UK stopped British fishermen taking sand eels, but the Europeans still take them. Other challenges include the gradually rising sea temperatures, meaning the salmon have to go further and further and further north to find the cooler temperatures that they need. Of course, up in Norway, there are predators like sea eagles waiting to snatch them out. And coming closer to home, the seals are crafty. They hang around the estuary as the salmon migrate back again and eat them. And not just in the estuary, this little fella here is at Wylam Pool, waiting for the poor salmon to come up over the ridge, and as soon as he gets over the other side, woof, and they're greedy. They just rip out the stomach, which is all the fatty content, and leave the rest of the fish. Needless to say, it drives the fishermen nuts, and they're trying to find a way to move the seals away from the Wylam Pool area. Why not, eh? So climate change is having an effect, of course, that we all know, and it's really the greater extremes that it's causing. So if we think about the drought, that reduces the water flow. If the water's not flowing so quickly, then the dissolved oxygen is less. The water's warmer, and warmer water also doesn't hold as much dissolved oxygen, so that's a big problem. There's floods, and the floods wash away the eggs in the redds, and they're lost. And we've already said that the temperature is critical for fertilization, hatching and maturation. And so TRT does have some remedies for these things. So we address it as best we can. We plant trees on the side of the river to provide shade and reduce the amount of temperature rise within the river. And of course the trees also help to retain water. And we use natural flood managements, leaky dams, remeandering the rivers, and creating holding ponds to stop these flood events happening as often as they do. So, coming down below the dam now, talk briefly about the freshwater pearl mussels. So the Tyne River is host to some unique and rare, fascinating native species. This is one of them. They're found in the River Reed in North Tyne, from Reed's Mouth down to Acombe, where the waters meet, the North and the South Tyne meet. And they're amazing, and their lifestyle and their contribution to the ecosystem is incredible. So if we look briefly at their lifestyle, then the females have the eggs within their shell, And then the male swims by them and releases his sperm into the water, and then the female mussels filter the water and get the sperm inside them, and that fertilizes their eggs. And the fertilized eggs stay in the female for a few months, and then in the summer they release 1 to 4 million glaucidia, which are tiny little things that float away downstream. And as they float downstream, they catch on the gills of either salmon or trout. And for reasons that we don't understand, in the North Tyne it's trout, and in Cumbria it's salmon. So they catch on the gills. They're tiny at this point. They're really about the same size as the end of a ballpoint pen. And they stay there for a few months, and they go up and down the river with the trout and the salmon, and it doesn't seem to bother the fish at all that they've got these clinging onto their gills. And then after a few months they drop off into the gravel beds and go down into the bottom of the gravel beds, and they stay there for a few years, and then they slowly mature. And altogether, a fully grown adult will mature and live for about 120 years, so a long time. The adult mussels can filter up to 50 litres of water a day, which is something like the amount that you would have for a normal shower. And as well as that, the mussels excrete little pellets of excrement, and they're very high in nutrients and used by the invertebrates, great source for them to feed. And so the food cycle goes on because the mussels filter the water, and the excrement feeds the invertebrates, and the invertebrates feeds the trout and the salmon, and the trout and the salmon carry the glaucidia up and down the river and make sure they don't all get floated out to sea. It's just amazing how these things are so interconnected. Unfortunately, the habitat conditions in the North Tyne are not optimal for breeding and maturing, and it's doubtful whether they're actually a self-sustaining population. A little bit like children in the UK, we're not having enough children to sustain the population, and in many other places around the world as well. So we've run a series of programs of work to improve the habitat, working with farmers and foresters to provide sediment catchment pools, fencing livestock from riverbanks, and providing water troughs and riparian tree planting. And just to give you some kind of an idea of the difference a simple fence can make, look at this. On the one side, of course, is all the mud where the cattle are, and the other side, the bank is preserved. So all that mud and sediment is not going into the river, but is keeping away from it. And more than that, because the manure coming from the cattle also doesn't go into the river, so the nitrates do not build up, you don't get a big algae bloom, and that also reduces your dissolved oxygen. So simple measures to help the freshwater pearl mussels, of course, equally help other invertebrates and other animals in the river, and that brings us now to the white-clawed crayfish. So the white-clawed crayfish is the only native crayfish species found in the UK, and the name comes because it's pale on the underside of its claws. It's found mainly in clean, calcareous, fast-flowing waters, and the reed and the wansbeck have got the largest populations in Europe. It's not just in the river. If you noticed, it's also here in the lochs on the Hadrian's Wall. But the white-clawed crayfish are declining due to the introduction of a non-native species, the American signal crayfish. So the American signal crayfish were brought into the UK about 20 years ago into the south of England as a commercial farming for people to eat. But they've escaped, of course. And the problem with the signal crayfish, the American crayfish, is that they carry the plague, aphanomyces, and that doesn't affect the American version, but it does kill the British version. So it's very analogous to what happened with the grey and the red squirrels on land. But they're even more pervasive than just carrying the plague, because they tend to be bigger than the native crayfish, and so they eat them. In fact, they eat anything in the river. And not only that, but they burrow into the banks and they destabilize the banks, and the banks collapse, and you get a lot of sediment in the river too. So they could completely decimate a river when they get really old and just remove any sign of life whatsoever. And when they've eaten everything else, they eat themselves. So monitoring is a big part of our work, and in conjunction with the Environmental Agency, we're assessing environmental eDNA to see what species are around. So we look for the white-clawed crayfish, the native ones, the signal crayfish, and the genetics of the Aphanomyces species too. Fortunately, to date, we do have the signal crayfish, but we don't have the plague as far as we're aware at the moment. But that, of course, means that we need to make sure that we do this check, clean and dry. Biosecurity is very important, and we teach that to not just to our own staff, but to other people too, to try and ensure that the plague stays away from us. The other thing that we're trying to do with these species is to translocate them. So we go and catch the crayfish. They don't move very quickly, fortunately. So we catch the crayfish, and then we move them in the South Tyne above up into Alston, above the metal mines, and I'm going to come to the metal mines in a moment. So we move them up above the metal mines into the so-called arc site that can't be got to by the signal crayfish, because the signal crayfish have got to go through the river, and the metal in the river kills them on the way up there. So we think that we're going to be able to establish populations of the white-clawed crayfish in the upper reaches of the North Tyne, the South Tyne, away from where the signal crayfish can go and get them. So that brings me neatly to the metal mining legacy. So mining stopped in the early 20th century. It's been mined up in the Alston area for since Roman times, and heavy metals, lead, silver, zinc, copper, cadmium, arsenic, they're the poisons that come into the waters, reducing invertebrate and fish numbers. And the metals pollute altogether 170 kilometres of the Tyne catchment watercourse. And of course, it's not just the upper reaches, but all that water gets carried down the Tyne and lands up in the mudflats in the Tyne and in the estuary as well. You can see in the red the density of the areas. The River Nent is the area that's most problematic from the point of view of these metals. And the Nent is only about half the expected numbers of fish and invertebrates because of the poisoning from the metal, which is about 200 times the actual safe recommended limit. There are some benefits to having metals around. Some of you will know about the Calaminarian grasslands that survive on these spoil heaps. They're rare, they don't flower for very long, and they tend to be protected because of that. But they cause problems for us when we're trying to stabilise the thing. So when you go up into the North Tyne, you see this area, and it's not natural at all, and it's astonishing how much of the area looks like this. So although the mining activity stopped last century, then the Tyne catchment is still being polluted, because when the mines stop working, the pumps stop, the water comes up in the mine and then flows out down into the rivers. And then it goes down from the rivers to the estuary, and then it causes a big environmental issue, because dredging happens in the estuary, and the dredging material needs to be taken either out to sea or put into landfill, and which way it goes depends upon how heavily polluted it is from the metals point of view, and you can imagine how expensive it is to do that process. And so what can be done in terms of the upper reaches and stopping more metals come down is going to be economically worthwhile to do. So what do we do? Well, our job in the Tyne Rivers Trust is to try and contain the particulate sediment rather than what's dissolved in the water, which is the coal mining responsibility. So we use natural methods as far as possible to try and contain the slag heaps and stop them going into the river. And so we can do that by revegetation. We obviously have to use plants that are metal resistant, because most plants aren't. But this technique, of course, is environmentally friendly and enhances biodiversity. We can use coir matting, and the coir matting is biodegradable, so that again can stop the spoil falling into the river. We create leaky dams to reduce the force of the water coming down, so it doesn't cut underneath the spoil heaps and cause them to fall in. And likewise, we can do log or stone revetments to contain the river in its natural course, and again prevent it cutting into the spoil heaps and causing more problems. Our current interventions retain about 1.5 tons of metal every year. Over the next 2 to 3 years, that's going to be tripled. And the work is mostly funded by the Environment Agency or the Coal Board. The Coal Board is responsible, even though we don't dig any coal out any longer, but the legal responsibility for the old mines and the pollution that they caused was not present at the time that they were working mines, and so in the year 2000 the government had to take over trying to clear up the mess rather than the original mine workers themselves. So what did the Coal Board do? Well, they worked with Newcastle University to find this. So this is an example of the Hag's Adit, and Adit is the channel where the water comes out of the mine. And this is an abandoned mine drainage tunnel at Nentsbury, discharging around 3 tons of zinc alone into the river each year. So it's a nature-based treatment system. There's a pipe that runs along, captures the river, the water coming out of the mine, and drops it into a series of tanks. And those tanks have got material in them of limestone, wood bark and straw, and natural bacterial reactions capture the cadmium and the zinc in that process. And then the water from the ponds is then put out into the wetland, and the plants take up the remainder. And altogether about 90% of the lead and the zinc can be recovered. So here's the actual where we're at now. So some of the ponds are already built, the rest are still to be built, but when they are built, then the egress from these ponds and the wetland will go into the Nent and then down to the Tyne cleaned out. It's expensive, and is the large scale. You can see the scale of the ponds when you look at the vans and things that are there. But as I've said, economically it's worthwhile when you take into account the whole catchment and the cost of removing stuff from the estuary. So nearer to home, the Ousebourne. So we do lots of things on the Ousebourne, but I've just chosen really one example here. The West Farm at Black Callerton, right at the top of the Ousebourne. So the rainwater from the shed used to fall directly onto the farmyard, and that of course had got all the muck from the cattle and everything else in, and then went straight into the river, because the river actually bordered immediately onto the side of this farmyard. It was rough, just on the white bit. They missed it off on the photograph, unfortunately. So we worked with the farmer and helped them gain some grants, and that grant enabled them to capture, using just a simple pipe system, to drain the water directly into the river that comes off the roof, and made it such that they can add in extra pipes and things like that. So it meant that the rainwater went straight into the river instead of carrying all the slurry and everything else with it. So simple but effective. And we work with smart rivers. So in the early part of this year, they helped us do a survey throughout the Ousebourne, looking at water quality scores and the number of invertebrates and the sorts of invertebrates were there. And this sort of citizen science projects that we want to do, they've now trained us how to do this ourselves, and so we will repeat it through the year to see whether the interventions that we're doing on the Ousebourne are actually making a difference to the quality of the water. And to Whitecroft Burn, your Gosforth Nature Reserve bête noire, which causes the flooding in the nature reserve in bad times. So what are we doing here? Well, we're working with Dynamic Rivers, which is a company which models what happens when you make interventions within the watercourses. And so in this particular instance, then they're looking at modelling what's happened if you block off a culvert to see where the water would go under those circumstances. And when they did it, they found that you can't just block the culvert off and the water will still flood. You have to do other things as well. And the kind of modelling that they use is this, so you can see when you block here where exactly the water is likely to land up at the end of the day, and see whether what your intervention you're planning on doing is actually going to do the business, or whether you've got to look towards something else. So we're trying to apply this, these science-based solutions in terms of hydrology. So just as the Tyne has changed throughout the years, with heavy industry and mining giving way to businesses like Fentimans, offshore wind turbine production, so too our charity has changed. From a charity initially focused on salmon and trout migration to taking a catchment-wide approach, reducing pollution from the legacy of metal mines and agriculture, green engineering techniques being used to minimise flooding and removing non-native species, and protecting our endangered wildlife. Have we succeeded? Well, we have in many aspects, and here's just a couple to remind you. The fish pass at Hexham enables the salmon and the trout to get upstream through this, which was the biggest obstruction in the Tyne at that time. And we're reducing flooding in villages by putting in our leaky dam systems. So we certainly have. But have we exceeded in all areas? Well, the answer, of course, is not. And we recognise that the legacy of a Victorian design sewerage system, an increasing population, irresponsible disposal of items into toilets, changes to the management and oversight of our national water resource, and the oversight of our national water resource, and the investment challenges for water companies have all impacted the quality of our water, and in particular increased sewage pollution. There have been some improvements. I showed you the Tyneside Sewerage Scheme, which it's been in operation since the 80s now, but capacity is still an issue and results in the storm overflows spewing sillage all too frequently into our rivers and seas. And this is the map from Northumberland Water site itself, and all those green are storm overflows which have the potential to, when serious water comes down, or if the system gets overwhelmed, to put water into the rivers and into the sea. Now, Northumbria Water provides storm spillages, so on this one, this graph here, the yellow ones are spillages that have caught through those storm overflows in the last 24 hours, and the blue one is one that's been still ongoing, and this was some data that I picked up the back end of last week. So they're beginning to give us some real-time information on storm overflows and when they flow over. But of course, they're not telling us how long they go for and under what circumstances. As you know, it should be exceptional circumstances that storm overflows work, and it's by no means the case that it seems to be that exceptional circumstances are the only trigger for it. And they continue to hide data from us. And of course it's not just Northumberland Water that hide it, but all the other companies are doing the same too. We need a different way forward. And as Look North highlighted not long ago, this is still an ongoing problem, and they highlighted particularly the Ousebourne, and we all know that the Ousebourne is far from free from sewage. And it really is going to take something like the Tyne sewerage system that was done in that 80s, someone to take it and say, right, this is what we have to do. So, what's the future for TRT and for our catchment? It's the biggest catchment in England, of course. There's about 50, 60 rivers trusts, by the way. Every significant river in England has a rivers trust attached to it. We happen to be one. And there is a parent Rivers Trust, which helps looking after us. So in going into the future, then the doing side of our work is still going to continue. Removing pollutants, non-native species, obstructions to fish migration. We're still going to be protecting endangered species, creating wetlands and building natural flood barriers. But we want to strengthen our existing relationships and build new partnerships with other organisations to achieve a better river, better region and a better life for all. Partnering with those who use the rivers for recreation, canoe clubs, wild swimmers for example, those who need the water for their businesses, and others who educate about the river, the estuary and the ocean life. We also want to work with the disadvantaged of society, the disabled, give them better access to the river, those who are deprived and struggling with health. You'd be amazed at how many school children have never been to the river that live in Gateshead, for example. There's a lot of people who, in North Shields even, who have not been to the beach. It sounds unbelievable in this day and age, but it's true. So increasingly we're trying to recognise the importance of encouraging access for all to this wonderful space for relaxation, recreation and well-being. And it's our belief that when people understand and value the river, then they won't trash it. So they won't go onto the riverbank and have their barbecue and not bring stuff home again afterwards. That's what our hope is. So, of course, I wouldn't be able to give this talk without our fantastic team, the staff in the middle, some of my trustees, fellow trustees on the left, and of course the volunteers, of which we have 200 or 300 volunteers who go out in all weathers, planting trees, pulling out the balsam and so on. So thank you all. So it's taken over half a century to reduce the pollution and remove or bypass obstructions in the River Tyne, to allow the salmon and the migratory trout to return to their upper reaches to breed. It'll probably take several centuries for the metal mine pollutants to leach out of the mudflats lining the tidal banks. Environmental actions take time. An old saying with iterations across many ages and cultures states, "A society grows great when old men plant trees in whose shade they shall never sit." Nowadays, of course, we should substitute old men for people of all ages, but nevertheless the message remains the same. The work we do today will benefit others tomorrow. Are we too late for all this effort? Well, an African proverb states the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, but the next best time is now. And so I hope I've convinced you that TRT has and continues to make a difference to the Tyne, its tributaries, fauna and flora, but there is much, much more to do. And we'll hope you'll all come on this journey with us to help us achieve a better region, better river, and a better life for all. And with that, I thank you.